Speaker, I've put forward with my able colleague, our industry critic, some very reasoned amendments to help improve the legislation that has been brought forward. But really, Mr. Speaker, we can no longer simply just let this government talk around the issues. It needs to start putting forward real policies like banning foreign owners from purchasing Canadian properties to give those Canadians that first chance of home ownership, Mr. Speaker. But this government continues to bring forward legislation that is not up to the task. Mr. Speaker, I see that my time is rapidly diminishing, but let me say again, it's always an honor to rise in this place. And again, I would just implore the government for my own riding, Mr. Speaker, that those flooding victims in both Merritt, Princeton, and other rural areas of British Columbia are counting on this government, Mr. Speaker. And unfortunately, they are told to wait as well. And this is the problem I have with this, Mr. Government. They're not addressing these important needs that Canadians have right now. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for putting forth some very reasonable amendments to the bill and for his advocacy on the housing file. However, I'd like him to expand a little bit more about the excessive spending and where we're going when the cost of this borrowing goes up. In particular, his comment about the over $20 billion a year that we're currently spending just to service the national debt. And considering that's really more money than we're putting in national defense, how volatile the world is right now, we're seeing what's going on with Russia and their invasion into the Ukraine. I'd like him to comment on that because I believe we need to make a serious investment into the national defense in the coming years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
And that's an excellent question from my colleague, Mr. Speaker, because as I said earlier in the speech, we're seeing that other important spending that Canadians count on, like healthcare, all right, that is set to go up at a certain rate, but our debt servicing will be far in demand. And in fact, the debt servicing rate will be far over what we spend in the fiscal year 2026, 2027 than what we spend on military. Yesterday, we had the Minister of National Defense try to assure this House that our Arctic sovereignty is not at risk. But if you look at where other countries have been putting their resources, Mr. Speaker, right? Russia has been investing heavily in nuclear ships, Mr. Speaker, so that they can push their sovereignty claims further into the Arctic. We need to ask ourselves, are we prepared to do the same? With the way that this government has spent, I would say, Mr. Speaker, we are not.
Question et commentaire.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to congratulate my colleague from the Finance Committee on his speech. At the Bloc Québécois, there's one thing that particularly bothers us about C8, and that is the 1% tax on underused housing that is owned by non-citizen or non-residents of Canada. Now, we could debate whether this is a good policy or not in the context of the current housing shortage, but this sets a precedent for the first time in history. The federal government here would interfere with property tax, which used to be something that was handled only by the municipalities and provinces. So I'd like to get my colleagues' comments on this subject, particularly on the subject of respecting provincial jurisdiction. The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
And I certainly want to appreciate the intervention by the member and his work that he does on behalf of his constituents. Mr. Speaker, in our Constitution, it's very clear that the federal government, rightly or wrongly, has the ability to tax into even areas like property taxes. It has the most taxing powers that provinces and municipalities do not share. It has a very wide range of tools. But typically, governments have trended not to go into those areas because you can't, first of all, there's only one taxpayer. But second of all, Mr. Speaker, the federal government does not have an established line of view into that area. And so this is the problem we have, Mr. Speaker, is again, they introduce all these new things, whether or not the 1% would be effective or not, whether or not they're violating traditionally what is considered a provincial area because municipalities and property taxes are provincial. I just again would say they're walking around the issue, not addressing it, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, my colleague was talking about his concerns with the federal government's fiscal capacity. Well, Mr. Speaker, you know who does not have concerns about fiscal capacity? It's the companies that made off like bandits with profiteering during a pandemic, who collected benefits from the federal government while paying out stockholder dividends and so on. I'm just wondering, Mr. Speaker, you know, in an effort to invest in people and in workers and making our communities all that they can be, why do the Conservatives neglect the fiscal capacity of the very richest and wealthiest corporations in this country, and they never put measures in place to actually tackle that gross inequality, which is expanding and has accelerated over the last 2 years?
Hear, 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 hear. The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
So my friend from the island will probably recognize that, first of all, we've been very critical of the government for the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy for allowing profitable companies to be able to access that while at the same time increasing dividends to shareholders or allowing for those bonuses to executives. Unlike when Minister Jim Flaherty had made some concessions on pensions to Air Canada, he put tight controls to make sure that executives couldn't profit from that. So we're on the record as opposing those kinds of payments. But Mr. Speaker, I'll remind the member this. We're not in government. If he has an issue, he should be pointing the finger across the way and not at the Conservatives, because this program was designed by this government, and what he probably would, they would describe as a bug, it's actually a feature, Mr. Chair.
Prise du débat.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Joliette. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're at the report stage now for C8, the Act to implement certain provisions of the economic update. At the block, we agree with most of what's in this bill. However, we do have one thing that troubles us, that is the federal government's interference with property taxes. It's a first in that area. There is an issue with housing and shortages. So we want to incentivize foreign residents who are not permanent residents to pay more if they do have a residence in Canada that is vacant. This measure can marginally help to resorb the housing crisis, but we're not against that aspect or principle of the legislation, but it's the way it's done that we disagree with, the manner. And what we see here is a dangerous precedent. It kind of looks like what we saw historically with the Federation. For the first time in Ottawa is occupying a new tax domain. The last one it wasn't occupying, I'm talking about property taxes. The section in C8 that taxes non-residents is a 1% tax on underused residential property. It's a good idea in theory, but is it up to Ottawa to do this? Also, it did so in a cavalier fashion without consulting the municipalities or provinces, and that's worrisome. For us, this is obviously a serious issue, particularly when we're talking about the fiscal capacity of every level of government. Property taxes are primarily reserved for municipalities and for other provincial areas such as school boards. We know that there are limited sources of revenue, and Ottawa is now stepping in to take a portion of this property tax. And as I was saying, this creates a precedent that is unfair. Moreover, this new tax was implemented without discussing things with the organizations and the organizations that do take care of property taxes. That's a serious issue. Of course, we're talking about several $100 million a year. This amount won't make our fiscal imbalance skyrocket, but it's what's at stake here. To seek this new tax, Ottawa and its departments and the CRA will develop a new mechanism to be able to take these taxes, and it will be able to use property taxes in the future as part of its revenue. And in the history of tax in Canada, we find this concerning. Why? Let's look back a bit. During the First World War, there was an exceptional circumstance and a war effort that was implemented, and Ottawa decided to take corporate income tax. What happened after? It was supposed to be temporary, but Ottawa continued to collect corporate tax, even though they said it would only be temporary to fund the First World War. The same thing happened once again during the Second World War. There was a new tax on individuals in Quebec. Quebecers wanted their money back, and in terms of property tax, during the Second World War, Ottawa said we have to fund the war measures, and these are exceptional circumstances. So there's an temporary exceptional tax on individuals that Ottawa is still taking today. And that is Ottawa's way of doing things. They start taxing something and they don't stop, even if the temporary circumstances are extraordinary in the beginning and they could justify this tax. And they always occupy all the types of areas, the alpha and the omega. But property taxes are usually taken by school boards, provinces, municipalities. And this is our area of expertise. We have limited resources. So we really have to be careful to delve into that area of taxation federally. Why? Because municipalities don't have enough resources to offer all the services that are under their jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, you know, every year roughly, the PBO publishes a report on the financial viability, and it's always with the same conclusion. During the pandemic, with exceptional expenses, Ottawa in the coming decades will have a surplus in its budget, but provinces will be heavily indebted if there are no major changes implemented. All provinces now are asking the federal government to increase its health funding up to 35% to achieve a better balance. That's what the conference board in its study has said as well. We need a rebalancing, a better balance. And the PBO has reminded us of this every year in his report. And what has he said in Ottawa? For the services that are being provided, there's too much tax, so we have to increase health transfers to the provinces. No, but the government's not doing this. They're putting their hand on the last fiscal area that it is currently not involved in, property tax, and it doesn't make sense. That's what, sorry, I'm using the wrong term here, but the constitutional expert, the Patrick Taillon appeared before the Finance Committee and said, however, just because it's a good idea, talking about property tax, doesn't mean it's an excuse to ignore our constitutional principles. From the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to the division of powers, the spirit and the letter of the Constitution must be respected. But without prior consultation and agreement with the provinces, in short, without a number of legal precautions, this good idea is a risk. Clearly, the real character of this legislation relates to the regulation of housing law. And there is no doubt that housing is an exclusive provincial jurisdiction in the private law of property and civil law, and more generally in social policy and local affairs. What this constitutional lawyer has said to us is that this tax is because it's trying to delve into housing law, seems to be an unconstitutional law. And the courts, unfortunately, will have to decide whether this is the case or not. And it will be pragmatic and intelligent to look at things upstream rather than facing legal challenges down the road. And when the act will be overturned, then all the federal government's infrastructure with respect to property tax will be up in the air, and there will be damage and useless spending, and it will make the municipalities more fragile. And if ever the courts do not find this act unconstitutional, it will still set a dangerous precedent, because there will be no cooperative federalism in this tax. So it would be unjust, and it is a serious issue. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, at the Finance Committee, the bloc suggested a very simple amendment, just to say, okay, the federal government will move forward with this tax. We're asking it to receive the approval of provinces to impose this tax. They need to consult the municipalities. And then, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I would like to turn to you today, because with respect to the clerks, you deemed our amendment to not be eligible. It did not broaden the scope of the legislation or denature it. It was just having our constitution respected. I'm very disappointed with your decision, which even made this historical precedent even worse with respect to provinces and municipalities. So I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, in spite of what I've just said. Thank you. Questions and comments?
The
Honourable Member for Sarnia. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the colleague for his fine speech. There are measures in this legislation for health and COVID testing, and every day I hear the bloc defending health in Quebec. So what does the member think about these measures? Will he support them? The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague, from Sarnia-Lambton. Obviously, in C8, there is funding for COVID tests. They'll be funded by the federal government, and the money will be sent to the provinces. We want to be able to follow up on this and have transparency, but obviously we agree with this necessary expense. But it reminds us that Ottawa is not doing enough for healthcare. And this has been since the Liberal government came to power in the 90s. They decided to solve its deficit issue by cutting healthcare transfers to the provinces. And since then, Ottawa has been receiving too much funding for the services it's offering, and we don't want this. We want money now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Come on.
Questions and comments?
For Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciated my colleague's speech, and I'm sure he will agree with me that a lot of water has passed under the bridge since the fall economic update was presented to the House back in mid-December, both here in Canada and all around the world. I know he and his party have been very active on the issue of climate change. And going forward, I'd just like to hear his thoughts on what kind of fiscal capacity he'd like to see the federal government direct towards climate change because of the economic costs that will be incurred if we do nothing or too little. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, these days I feel like we're going from one crisis to another. There was the Emergencies Act that was imposed here because of the siege on our city. And then now we're facing an unimaginable war in 2022, a barbaric war with apparent crimes against humanity. And now there's an environmental crisis, of course. Yesterday, the governor of the Bank of Canada reminded us at committee that we're underestimating the economic impact of the climate emergency. We have to take action right now. It's urgent. Obviously, in Quebec, we have used the carbon tax model. We think that this model could have worked very well elsewhere, and we're disappointed to see that not all U.S. states and Canadian provinces have used the same system. We have to do more, and at the bloc, we're proposing an ambitious green financing project that will allow us to support green carbon neutral infrastructure. rather than polluting projects. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Mirabel. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My colleague spoke about this new interference of the federal government in provincial jurisdiction, but more than creating a precedent, it seems that we're changing the way the tax itself is designed and received. The tax level won't really have a big impact on the housing shortage. Can the federal government use other methods, such as the one asked by Quebec to solve the housing crisis? I'd like to know what my colleague is proposing. The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my esteemed and brilliant colleague from Mirabel for his question. The housing shortage affects everyone in Quebec and across Canada. It's a major issue, and we need a group of measures to solve it. Yes, property tax of 1% for non-residents for underutilized housing is symbolic. It's not really a big, it won't really have a big impact. And there's not enough cooperation with provinces. The problem is that there isn't enough housing. We need social housing. Ottawa removed itself from social housing in the 90s, and we've seen the impact of this. We've had decades and decades of underfunding in this area, and this is what it gives. Thank you.
Continue.
Resuming debate.
The honourable member for Langford, Malahat. We'll do that again. Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much appreciate to be able to rise today and contribute to the House's debate of the Liberal government's Bill C-8, which has been faithfully reported back to the House by the Standing Committee on Finance. The committee did consider one amendment to that, and of course today we're dealing with the report stage amendments brought forward by my Conservative colleagues. I very much appreciate the work that committee members did in examining this bill, and especially want to thank my colleague, the member for Elmwood-Transcona, who of course is my caucus's finance critic and has been shouldering a lot of work at that committee. Of course, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-8 is an act that is going to try and implement the certain provisions that were presented to the House in the fall economic statement. And I think it would be a gross understatement to say that the country and indeed much of the world have changed since mid-December. And it seems, I know from feedback from people in my riding and people that I work with here in this chamber, the pace of change over the last 2 months has really left our heads spinning. And we seem as a country to be lurching from crisis to crisis these days, and it's not giving people much of a breather to accept their changed reality. And I am hearing a lot of accounts of the mental health stress this has put on people. I mean, it was back in mid-December, Mr. Speaker, we were just as a House beginning to get a glimpse of how bad the Omicron wave really was going to be. I mean, I remember the news reports in early December that there was some hope that the variant that first emerged in South Africa and was detected there did not seem to have as much lethality to it. But of course, that was blown out of the water by the concerns of how fast and how rapidly it spread. And so that even if a smaller percentage of people ended up going to the hospital, that small percentage, when you had the variant passing through our population so rapidly, did give rise to very considerable fears that our hospital system would be overwhelmed. And of course, we have had a change in leadership with one of our political parties in this House. And we had the protests descend on Ottawa and in many cities across Canada, which turned into an illegal occupation, blockades at our border, further putting strains on our relationship with the United States. And then, of course, just a few short days after that was ended, Mr. Speaker, we now have a fully modern and raging conflict raging in Ukraine, where unprovoked Russian aggression is now putting the lives of 40 million Ukrainians at risk. So, Mr. Speaker, here we are. The world has changed quite a bit. And I do want to acknowledge the frustrating time that is for so many people, especially in Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. They are, like many Canadians, dealing with the inflationary pressures. They see the results in the price of food at the grocery store, the cost every time they fill up their vehicles. And what they've also witnessed, though, Mr. Speaker, over the last 2 years is the fact that so many of the wealthy in Canada, and indeed many of our most profitable corporations, they have seen their profits soar during this time. And many of those companies actually took pandemic benefits and were guilty of paying out dividends to their shareholders. So when you see people, the hardworking families in my riding of Couch and Malahat Langford, they're working, it seems sometimes twice as hard as their parents, but for less money. And these pressures are putting families through to the breaking point. And that's why I've always been proud of a party that stands for trying to ease that inequality in Canada, making sure the very rich in our country do pay their fair share. Because if they don't, Mr. Speaker, that ends up falling, the burden falls on working families. In my riding now, in the space of 1 year, depending on what part of the riding you're in, you saw housing prices increase from anywhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40%. That's in 1 year, Mr. Speaker. And with those stratospheric record levels of housing costs, of course, many people were trying to sell their homes during that time to take advantage of the high prices. But all of that selling in the Cowichan Valley also put a huge crisis on rental availability. Because of course, when people are putting their house up for sale, usually the tenants are evicted because it's not really known if the new owner wants to inherit tenants or not. We have also, Mr. Speaker, the worst record in the G7 of combating climate change. In my province of British Columbia, we saw a record heat wave in June. We saw wildfires consume so many communities right across the province. And then just a few short months later, catastrophic floods that effectively cut off the Port of Vancouver, our busiest port, from the rest of the country. And so a smart government would be looking at the evidence that these climate change natural disasters are going to keep piling up if we don't address them. A smart government would look at the economic toll that is going to place on our future ability to raise revenue. And you know, for my conservative colleagues who like to proclaim themselves as fiscally responsible, if they ignore what damage this is going to do to future tax revenues, at our ability to help communities from coastal inundation, protect them from wildfire danger, standing up for our hardworking men and women in agriculture who seem to be dealing with flooding and droughts at a much more precipitous pace. And I know from my time at the Standing Committee on Agriculture, proud member for 4 years now, all farmers will tell you that they are on the front lines of climate change, and they need to have some recognition of the good work that they are doing, but also they need a partner in Ottawa that's going to help them take advantage and thrive through these very uncertain times. So it's all about choices, Mr. Speaker. With Bill C-8, you know, I think it's a sense of regret. For me being here, it's a sense of regret of what could have been and what should have been. But that being said, you know, if through this measure we are going to propose things like allowing small businesses to acquire equipment that's going to improve the quality of their indoor air, I think that is a solid investment. And just because we are starting to see some very hopeful signs about us getting out of this latest variant from COVID-19, it doesn't mean to say that there won't be future airborne illnesses that would make indoor air quality much better if we were to make these targeted investments. I also like, Mr. Speaker, the idea of, you know, allowing for an increase in the school supplies tax credit and allowing us to expand that eligibility criteria to include electronic devices that educators will benefit from. And so, you know, a lot of people are struggling in making sure that they can get through with those family budgets. So little measures like that for many families can actually go quite a long way. And I'm also interested in the proposal here in Bill C-8 about the refundable tax credit for the return of fuel levy proceeds to agricultural businesses. This has been an issue that we have been seized with at the Standing Committee on Agriculture, because especially when it comes to activities like grain drying or even heating their barn, I'm all for giving farmers an alternative that is not based on fossil fuels. But what we heard very clearly at the Standing Committee on Agriculture was that the technologies that are fossil-free fuel are not yet commercially viable, and they won't be so for another 10 years. So if we're going to make sure we're trying to give that price incentive, we still have to make sure that a viable alternative does exist for our farmers, which is why I'm in favor of giving them these specific and very targeted breaks so that they can make it through with their bottom line. And then, Mr. Speaker, in part 2 of C8, there's basically establishing that 1% annual tax on the value of vacant or underutilized residential real property. And that would only be when the direct and indirect owners are non-residents or non-Canadians. Again, on housing, there are so many more ways that this government could have tackled this very big issue. I would say that this is sort of a good first start, but there's much more that needs to be done. And I know the government likes to sort of pat itself on the back with all of the things that it has done with housing, but the proof is in the pudding, Mr. Speaker. And if we still see housing prices rise to these stratospheric heights, we have to measure the effectiveness of a policy against that reality. So I see my time is running down, Mr. Speaker. I think, I'll conclude there just by saying that we do have a budget. A federal budget will be coming in the next number of months. And I sincerely hope that the government realizes that this is the time for bold policy action to really make sure that Canada comes through these uncertain and very challenging times. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. We'll do it the right way, I guess, because there's somebody up. The honourable member for, and I should have this one, and I mix up. The Glengarry Prescott Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the pleasure of sitting in with this honourable member at the Standing Committee of Agriculture, and he raised an important point. I know it doesn't impact the province where he's from, but we have heard from farmers on the importance of having the availability of a carbon rebate for grain dryers and for heating their barns. I would just like to know, can he inform this House how important it is to pass C8 so they can get access to this important tool? Thank you.
For Cowichan, Melhat Langford.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And allow me to return the compliment to my friend who I have had the pleasure of serving on that committee with. And, he and I think, are the two longest serving members on that committee. We've heard repeatedly from farmers about their willingness to do the right thing and be a central part of the conversation on how we combat climate change. But when it comes to the hard choices that they have to make when they're purchasing new equipment or finding an energy source, we first of all want to make sure that those viable alternatives exist, which is why until they are developed and until they are commercially viable, we prepare the next necessary tax breaks to help them through those tough times.
In comments, question et commentaire, the honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Cowichan, Melhat Langford, for his speech. And he also raised their critic, the MP for Elmwood Transcona. And I'd like to thank that member, specifically a Finance Committee. He supported the member of Parliament from North Simcoe's amendment to C8 that would ban foreign buyers from purchasing Canadian residential properties. This member has mentioned that in his riding on the island, that we've seen amazing jumps in home prices, lots of speculators that are there, including foreign. So, Mr. Speaker, he lamented that there is so much more that C8 could have been. Could he maybe enlighten this House as to why, first of all, the government would vote against something that their own Prime Minister has promised to do, has promised those Canadian young families to want to get into home ownership, and why he seems that when it comes to the chance to vote for something that meaningfully will address that they vote against?
Member Cowichan, Melhat Langford.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess, well, sometimes the workings of Liberals, like Conservatives at committee, can remain a mystery, and we don't always know the full reason of why they vote the way they do. But that being said, I agree with him. So much more could have been done. But, as an opposition party, we have to respect the right that it's the government's prerogative to devote what time they will to the bills that they bring forward. And, we can only deal with the parameters that the government sets out. For me, I'm always looking ahead to the next day, to the next fight, to the ways that I can influence government policy and make sure that it's doing right by the residents of Cowichan, Melhat Langford. And I very much look forward to that opportunity being with the next federal budget.
Questions and comments, question et commentaire.
The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my colleague for Joliette earlier mentioned that a proposed amendment by the Bloc Québécois on C8 had been rejected, but I would like to hear what my colleague has to say. What does he think about the fact? What does he think of the proposal asking the federal government to consult provinces before butting into their exclusive jurisdiction? We know that there is a housing crisis. We've made many recommendations, but we believe that provincial jurisdictions should be respected.
Honourable Member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess the way I'd answer his question is this. I mean, the federal taxation power is a very broad power, and it can be open to a lot of interpretation. And courts have been a little bit wary about intruding on that specific right. That being said, I think the challenging times that we live in demand that the federal government look at unique and innovative ways to raise revenue. The NDP has long championed things like a wealth tax, and that's something I will continue to proudly fight for. But on his main question of consultation with the provinces, absolutely. If we are going to have a strong federal partnership, the provinces play in very important roles in that, and I will never shy away from promoting that consultation should happen on a regular basis.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate, the Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak today to Bill C8 at report stage. I may also include some general comments because I didn't get a chance to speak to Bill C8 when it was in the House earlier because they shut down debate on it. But let me just go through the different parts of the bill that we see. And